Next keynote is called Research and Development in Bitcoin with Korok Ray. He's an associate professor at Texas A&M University, where he has worked to advance Bitcoin education at the largest university in the United States. He taught the first ever Bitcoin class at Texas A&M, and he's dedicated to researching Bitcoin mining in Texas. He's a game theorist who studies decentralized incentive systems like Bitcoin, and this year he is launching principlesofbitcoin.com to teach Bitcoin from first principles online based on his university teaching. Welcome, Korok.
Thank you, Natalie. I feel like Taylor Swift, so that's great. So howdy, my name is Korok. I'm a professor at Texas A&M. Today I'm going to talk to you about Bitcoin R&D, the undiscovered country. I want to tell you a little bit about what I think is a beautiful future for Bitcoin. And to start that, actually, I want to start talking, let's first talk about the past. So I'm going to bring you back to 2007. I was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, and I joined my dissertation advisor on the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. And within a few months, one day we got a call from the West Wing, and the question was, how do we recapitalize the financial sector? And so we spent the next several months, which is an eternity in White House time, trying to figure that out. We talked to everybody under the sun, both academics, Wall Street, policymakers globally and domestically. And the truth is that we had no idea. That was the truth, and neither did anyone else. So we didn't really have a consensus because there was no consensus. We fought this debate internally with the Treasury Department for several months, and we were winning that fight, but at some point the political winds turned and we started losing that fight. So I think the lesson that I remember from that White House is that question from the West Wing. The answer is less important, but the problem was the question itself. I think it reflected a fatal conceit that essentially a small group and band of individuals with the best credentials and the best intentions can, in fact, fathom the infinite complexity of a market economy and design an intervention with no unintended consequences. I believe that Satoshi Nakamoto also understood the limits to human reason and the problems with central power and deliberately designed Bitcoin around this core principle of decentralization and distributed knowledge, which is with us today and something I'm going to discuss at length throughout the rest of my talk. So let me show you one of the chief features of Bitcoin, which is its value as a scarce asset. One of the geniuses of Bitcoin's design is that it really is digital scarcity for the first time. And so what I tried to do is I looked at the returns from holding Bitcoin at, say, a 5-year horizon, and I asked, well, what would be that return if you bought it at the highest possible price and sold it at the lowest possible price? And so that would be your lower bound of your payoff. That would be the worst you could do. And I looked at that for all possible horizons. And this is what it looks like. Okay? So what do we see? We see after about 3.25, 3.3 years, you will not lose money. After about 3.45 years, you will beat the market. After 3.5 years, you will beat Warren Buffett. And then beyond that, everything else is icing on the cake. Now, the past does not predict the future, right? And obviously, we don't know the future. But I'm an empirical economist. I'm a social scientist. We have to look at the facts. And so to me, this is the top 1,000 reasons to hold Bitcoin. If you forget everything else I say, at least remember this picture. And so this is, I think, the first time in the history of humankind where we see this kind of the value of scarcity illustrated in such a novel way. Okay, so in 2021, I held the first ever Bitcoin conference at a major university at Texas A&M. We had 35 speakers, 50 registrations. We had dozens of high-profile speakers, Ray Dalio, Tim Draper, the head of the Dallas Fed, and Michael Saylor keynote. It was a big success. It was a lot of work. These for people who put on conferences. I did a smaller conference, an academic conference of 100 submissions for papers, 20 faculty for a more academic investigation of Bitcoin. Now, I realized that my students weren't really understanding what was going on in these conferences, so I decided to teach the first ever Bitcoin class at a major university. I now teach two of them. I teach the Bitcoin protocol, which is a deep investigation of Bitcoin at the code base, and I teach an accounting and finance class on Bitcoin for a broader audience. Texas is Bitcoin country, if you have not been. Almost 20% of Bitcoins around the world are mined in Texas alone. So some of the biggest mines are within an hour of our backyard. And our lab on campus is exploring all the innovation in Bitcoin mining, trying to understand energy optimization and usage. But I'm not going to talk too much about mining. I could talk for hours about it. Instead, I want to focus on Bitcoin's R&D. And again, I want to look at the past and show you what one of them put together, a graphic explaining the 50-year genesis of Bitcoin in ideas. So this is 50 years of computer science, mathematics, economics, that are all based on the technology that we know and love today. Bitcoin is not another social network or a dating app. Okay? It is real science with real technology behind it, and it goes back a long way. Bitcoin research, just like Bitcoin itself, is a global phenomenon. These are the institutions where all of the faculty wrote papers in the last year. And so we need more people from the US, I'll tell you that. So this should show you that there's an ocean of knowledge in Bitcoin, in the research community, that I think people are just now beginning to discover. I spent almost most of April and May, up until most of March and April, reading about 300 of these papers. And I think one of the great untapped opportunities is to make some of this knowledge more publicly available. So I built this little mental model of where the research is and development on Bitcoin. So if I could make a slight simplification, imagine these four basic categories of Bitcoin, the four main pillars: cryptography, networking, transactions, and the blockchain. So in yellow here are academic papers in the last 10 years that have been and this is just a sample. And I've kind of positioned them. This is not completely scientific. It was my own judgment where to put this on which box. And I'm also going to show you where the developments are in green and the links between them in orange. And so this shows you that there is a lot of communication between the research side and the development side. And so this is actually inspiring for us for what I think can continue to happen with Bitcoin development. Now, Alex mentioned a little bit of this, and I'll continue to dive in. The mental model I think you should have is that the Bitcoin blockchain is the base layer. It's the orange boxes at the bottom. And the Lightning Network is a second layer on top of the base layer. I think a useful trick is imagine you walk into a bar, and you give your orders to the bartender. The bartender is writing down your orders, maybe giving you drinks, but he doesn't cash you out until the end of the night. And so that's what the Lightning Network is basically doing. It's doing a lot of these payments off-chain, which are recorded inside of what's called a payment channel. And it's only recording the closing of the bar tab at the end of the night. And so one thing that people have realized, I think, this last year is that even if you do this, the Lightning Network, which itself is an ingenious design, has one limit, which is that you're limited to you have to make a closing transaction for each channel, opening and close. And so bringing even 1 billion people on Bitcoin would be 1 billion transactions. And so let me tell you where I think the community is right now and the best solution to this, which is, again, Alex mentioned this. I'll go into more depth. This is what's called a Chaumian mint. Okay? And David Chaum was a famous cryptographer who came up with this idea. And this is now getting implemented, where you have multiple users, say Eva and Ethan, and the first step is they would, say, provide some of their property or assets to the mint. The mint would then sell that for Lightning. The mint would issue eCash, or electronic cash, which is essentially a paper version of Bitcoin, to the users, and then they would then use that to trade. Eva wants to sell a car to Ethan. Well, Ethan's got eCash. Eva takes it, and they can swap. Okay? Now, the mint interfaces with what's called a Lightning service provider, and that has a connection to the blockchain, and they can engage with transactions as they need to, Lightning transactions. Now, what if you have multiple mints? Well, you can do that. You could have cashew as one mint on the left. A Fedi mint is another structure on the right. They are different mints, which each have their own different paper products. And what the question becomes, well, what happens if Ethan wants to sell a car to Fred? Well, Fred has Fcash, which is from his mint, gives that to Ethan. Ethan can then swap that with his mint to get eCash, which is useful to him. And the eMint needs to essentially do something with the Fcash. Well, it turns around, goes to his Lightning service provider, which can swap it for Lightning. And then the LSP can also then swap the Fcash for Lightning with the Fmint. And so these kinds of trades can happen in the future where the Lightning service provider or some other entity acts as essentially a clearinghouse for these different forms of paper versions of Bitcoin. Now, this might seem strange to you to have this structure, but I will say in the history of the United States, actually, before the Civil War, this is what banking was like. This is before we had the Federal Reserve. We had just a network of banks that would issue their own banknotes. The Andover Bank would issue bank dollars. There was no US dollar at the time. And the collateral of the time was gold. Alex would deposit gold to the Andover Bank and get banknotes that he would then use. Same thing with the Bedford Bank. And then there was a bank called the Suffolk Bank that would act as this intermediary whose purpose was to swap notes in between each of the smaller banks. So we have some historical precedent that this design has actually worked in the past. Of course, the Civil War changed everything when the government needed to fund the war, so I guess some things don't change. So then eventually the dollar became standardized, but before that there was about a 30-year period where we had essentially competitive issues of currencies, all backed by gold as the underlying asset. And I think that is a very natural vision for Bitcoin in the future. So back to this picture, we have a base layer of the blockchain, and we have above that a Lightning network. And then above that, possibly a series of mints, where the Lightning network is not even necessarily your network for buying coffee. That can happen at the mint level, but the Lightning network is connecting the different mints together for global adoption of Bitcoin. OK. Let me try to give you some use cases that might be specifically useful for you as you walk down your Bitcoin journey. So imagine that your corporate treasury holds some Bitcoin. In order to spend that Bitcoin, you need to sign for that Bitcoin. One of the innovations that's been around in Bitcoin since inception is something called multi-signature, where you have multiple signatures in order to release the Bitcoin. So in this case, for example, suppose your CEO, CFO, and COO all have a signature, and you need a majority of them, say 2 of 3 of them, to sign for Bitcoin. This is actually a much more robust and safe way to transact because you're not locking up all of the responsibility in one person. But things can still happen. So let's suppose that 2 of these 3 people lose their keys. Then you're in trouble. Then that Bitcoin is hard to access because you need 2 of 3 to access it. Well, what you can do now is that your base case can be a 2 of 3 multi-sig. But now you could also have some built-in fail-safes. So you could say that after 30 days, that multi-sig could degrade to a 1 of 3 multi-sig, where now, let's say 2 of the keys are lost, then you can only need 1 person for the key to have the key to unlock the funds. Let's say all 3 of them die on a plane crash back from Vegas. OK, then your Bitcoin's lost. Well, you can build in another fail-safe that after 90 days, your chairman can have access to that Bitcoin on a 1 of 1 multi-sig. So this decision tree, which I just showed you, is kind of cool because it actually can be represented directly on the blockchain. There's a data structure now in Bitcoin called Taproot, which has been active since 2021. And it can replicate exactly that tree that I just drew. In fact, it can do a lot more. That tree can be 128 levels deep. And to tell you, that means that you can have 2 to the 128 branches and items in the tree, which is an enormous number. And so I'll tell you later why that's kind of an interesting problem to have. This is all available today. Let me give you a few examples of some technologies that are coming on the horizon with Bitcoin and some use cases that would be useful for you. I expect these to be in Bitcoin within the next year or two. So there's one idea that's been in the developer community called vaults. And the idea is that when Alice sends Bitcoin to Bob, it's a little, you could see it as a high-risk transaction because if she loses her key, then someone else could take her funds. Well, now with the vault, Alice could send her Bitcoin to the vault, and it would sit there, kind of like an escrow account, for some time, say a week. And if she feels like her Bitcoin's at risk, she can claw that back into her account within that week. If not, then that Bitcoin can just move over to its target. And so this is one example of a little bit of a fail-safe that gives you some more, and this will all be on the blockchain to use the native security of Bitcoin, which is the strongest in the world. Okay, here's another one. One of the most common transactions in the financial markets are repurchase transactions. These are called repos. These are used by banks in order to satisfy essentially their reserve requirements set by the Federal Reserve. And so banks interact with the financial markets. Let's say there's a pension fund. A bank needs some short-term money to meet its reserve requirements. It has some collateral, like a treasury bond. It uses that collateral for a short-term loan to the pension fund. And the next day, as soon as the next day, they reverse that transaction, where the bank pays interest on the short-term loan. It would be fully possible with some innovations in Bitcoin since 2021 to replicate this on the blockchain if you wanted. You could have essentially the data of the bond could be represented on chain, and you could use the Bitcoin as the medium of exchange. I think in the future, we'd actually use the Bitcoin as the collateral itself. Okay. Here's another, I think, idea for some use cases in the corporate environment that might be interesting. I think, again, imagine you have a group of institutions, you could say banks or corporations, that that transact a lot with each other, but they don't want to have these transactions hit the blockchain each time. Well, what will be possible soon is something called a payment pool or a coin pool. In this case, 6 different institutions can share a Bitcoin output together, and they can all contribute some amount of balances to the pool. And they can trade within the pool without making on-chain transactions. So that repo that I just said, if 2 different banks want to swap Bitcoin, they can do it in the payment pool. Bank D to Bank C can make a trade. That doesn't have any problems. And if any of them want to exit the pool, they can extract the funds, and they can just make an on-chain transaction. 2 Bitcoin from A goes to some third party, and then we'll reformulate the pool at a later date. So these are some of the, I think, the best ideas today that are in the Bitcoin ecosystem that all will hopefully spur adoption and make Bitcoin more usable for institutions primarily and individuals as well. Okay. Okay, now let me tell you about what I feel is the undiscovered country. Okay, so this part is going to be fun. I believe that, and this is my conviction, I'm making an argument, this is not a fact, but my opinion here is that the ultimate use case of Bitcoin in, say, 100 or 200 or 500 years will not be humans but machines. And the reason I say this is that if any of you have interacted with Bitcoin, I think this was more the case maybe when Bitcoin started, less the case every year. It is a little bit tricky because you have to deal with keys and with QR codes and large random numbers, and it might seem a little unintuitive for human users. All of this is natural for machines. And as we are at the wave of massive technological progress, I believe the biggest opportunity will be deep integration between machines and the entire Bitcoin network at different levels. Okay. So I'm going to include just a few. I'll try to keep this pretty understandable, not too technical, but I don't want to sound like Kathy Wood, so I want to make sure that I do have some substance. Okay. So what we can do now with Bitcoin, we can do machine-to-machine payments. This is possible today over the Lightning Network. Okay, so imagine you're driving your Tesla, or the Tesla's driving itself on the highway. Okay, the machine could easily pay its tolls for you. And we kind of have a version of that technology today with e-tag. And that's, or easy tags, as we say, or Texas tags in Texas. That would be what I would call vehicle to infrastructure congestion pricing, or congestion payments. So that's a natural next step. But I think the next step beyond that are vehicle to vehicle payments. How many times have you been driving on a one-way road, stuck behind an 18-wheeler, and you just wish you could just pay him a little bit of money to pull over? Okay? In the future, your car will bargain with that 18-wheeler for you, and it will all happen autonomously. Okay? So vehicle-to-vehicle payments, I think, are definitely in the cards. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about machine-to-machine payments today and how they're operating as a prototype of what can happen in the future. So the Federal Communications Commission owns and has always owned all the airwaves above the United States. What they do is they auction off these airwaves to the wireless companies, who then operate these for mobile broadband. Wireless companies participate in these auctions. And traditionally, they used to auction the states and the regions off one at a time. So Sprint would bid $1 billion for California, maybe another $1 billion for Nevada. But what the wireless companies realize is that sometimes the combination is worth more than the sum of the parts. And so maybe if you can get both, you'd be willing to pay $3 billion. So this is actually then innovated, and this created a new kind of auction called a combinatorial auction. It's combinatorial because you're looking at combinations of things, not just individual units. And if you have 50 states, you have actually 2 to the 50 possible combinations. That's a very large state space. It's hard for us to imagine things that big, but it's easy for computers to do. And so today, in these auctions, in this last auction, when they auctioned off for this last round, computers were the ones that were bidding in these auctions and trading afterwards. So we already have some evidence that this is happening today, and I believe this idea will carry forward into the future. There's a problem in computer science that's called secure multi-party computation. We're all IT people, so hopefully this won't be too unfamiliar. The basic idea is you have a group of servers that are performing some computation together. So imagine that today that might be done by AWS, a centralized model. But in the future, as the GPUs increase in size and scale, we're going to have different clusters, and maybe they're doing some AI computations as a group. And you want to make sure that the individual units, the individual servers, don't abort the computation or fall offline. So there's a lot of cryptography and computer science behind this. And it turns out in the last 6 months, this technology is now available on Bitcoin. And the basic idea is that you can do the computation off-chain, and all you need to do is to have some representation of the computation on-chain that you use for dispute resolution. And so the analogy here is that think of the dispute resolution on-chain as the court in a courtroom, and the off-chain is the behavior in the streets. And so when we all know that there are laws, traffic laws and speeding rules, but very few of us actually end up in court. We go there if there's actually a dispute to resolve, but the laws themselves are enough to enforce behavior in the real world. And I think this is actually a deep idea that is just at the beginning of its implementation in Bitcoin. So let me identify what I think are 3 innovations that's happening right now in the economy, in the technological economy, and that are going to affect Bitcoin in a big way. The first is large transactional complexity, which is coming from Taproot. That was that binary tree that I showed you with all those different levels. That can be almost infinitely large. And if you have trees on top of trees, you could represent an enormous amount of data, essentially, onto the Bitcoin blockchain in a very, very concise way, since only the hash of that tree is what gets imprinted onto the chain. The second is these innovations on secure multi-party computation called BitVM. We are just at the beginning of this journey. People are now asking things like, well, how do you play chess or poker on Bitcoin if you had really high stakes, like $1 million bets? I don't think though we're in Vegas, I don't think those are going to be the end uses of this computation. But just like artificial intelligence, figuring out how these things work in finite, well-defined games is going to open up all kinds of opportunities for the future. And the final major transformation in artificial intelligence is deep neural networks. And integrating this, I think, with Bitcoin is going to be the true undiscovered country. So one example, I think, is we could imagine autonomous trade where agents are trading with each other. They are avatars representing at a high level your own wishes, either as a corporation or an individual. And they're bargaining in very high-dimensional spaces for packages of all kinds of different items. Using, right now, the best technology today is multi-agent reinforcement learning, but that'll change over time. The communication may be in machine language, or probably in the future, maybe even in natural language. Another example, trustless auctions. Okay, the combinatorial auctions I showed you with the FCC. In that case, we already have agents that are bidding in the auctions. We can now have agents that design the auctions. So in the digital economy, you could imagine a creator who's creating a digital good needs to interface with all these different vendors. All of that contracting, as well as the payment, is happening through these auctions. Industrial procurement. Imagine you are building a skyscraper, and you have a network of vendors who are providing bids. And you could get individual bids, or maybe some of the vendors can provide spray foam insulation as well as your HVAC as a discount. And there are a large number of combinations that could work. Or you're a robotics company that's building a robot with thousands of inputs. Okay? And so those are examples where I think the computational complexity of machines is really going to have a big edge. My hope is that we could hopefully unemploy the ultimate middleman, investment bankers, and move IPOs and the equity markets over in some level towards some manifestation into Bitcoin. I don't know if you realize, but outer space is a junkyard. So this is a picture from NASA of all the orbital space debris. The problem is that we have a classic tragedy of the commons. So the first step is we have to figure out as a society a way to assign property rights in space. But once we do that, we could imagine a future where we have essentially space either countries and companies that own pieces of space and offer rights of passage to other private players. And they can do this in transacting and negotiating in Bitcoin. Perhaps what I think is the biggest idea in this space, and probably the most unexplored, is what are called prediction markets. A prediction market is a market that lets you express any trade on any event at any point in the future. It's a very general class of markets. We know from economics that markets are very useful for facilitating trade between individuals. If you think about the story of American capitalism, it is closely connected to the story of the equity markets and the amount of wealth that we've been able to create through the equity markets. And part of that is being able to essentially take a bet on a young company that needs financing. Some of the benefits of doing that through, say, the equity markets is that it forces information disclosure for companies to provide information to the marketplace through that process of price discovery, and it enforces some accountability. So imagine if you could bet on, say, something like, would a politician have to adhere to their campaign promises? Just having that price out there would have possibly massive implications for the political system alone. We could also create all kinds of new markets that don't yet exist. The equity markets have been around for a while, but the bond markets are 10 times as large, and they're largely offline and analog. So let's forget about moving them to be just to be digital, but let's move them into some version of onto Bitcoin, along with all kinds of new markets. So imagine you are a homeowner in New Orleans, and you can't get homeowners insurance because the price of insurance is too high, or maybe the insurance companies are not insuring in New Orleans anymore after the last flood. Instead, you can place a bet on essentially a prediction market for if there will be a flood that month. Most of the time, you won't have it. Maybe once every few years, you will get a flood, and you'll get a payout by being on the other side of that bet. That essentially serves the function as an insurance contract in a place where it wasn't available before. Economists are now talking about building out a future forward energy market, a fully forward energy market where you could buy and sell energy at any point in the future. A prediction market may be one way to implement that. And what's probably most passionate to me is the implications for talent. Imagine that there was a marketplace for observing what does the market believe on whether we will have 10% or 10x the number of software engineers in 10 years or 20 years. That can have massive benefits to the young student in college who wants to decide on what to major in. And you could imagine that there would be companies that could serve to essentially equitize that human capital. And so you could take bets on people, and those people could finance their education in their new companies in ways that were not possible before. Why is all of this better on Bitcoin than anything else? For a few reasons. There is fast and final settlement on Bitcoin. Okay, so machines are not going to be talking to each other on the Visa network, right? They're not going to wait 30 days to get payment. It's not going to be on a credit network. It's probably going to be on some Lightning or some iteration. The computation is trustless, as we're going to need in the digital economy, where computers essentially must adopt the worst assumption, the worst case assumption, because that is the key to ensuring security. Transactions can be extremely complex, as I've discussed, and it's essential that the base layer is secure. If you're placing a bet on the price of electricity in 20 years, you don't want to have to worry about inflation. And so you want to be using the most secure asset that exists, which is Bitcoin. So we're not there yet, but I think that I can see a path for us to get here. A few things that I think we need on the research side: we will need easier scripting to be able to write easier scripts onto Bitcoin. That's happening now. We still will need simple verification on chain. It still needs some way to go. And I think we'll need more innovations on layer 2s. We have a really good network for payments, but we need really a layer 2 network or adaptations to Lightning for contracts. In the real business world, the actual payment itself is one part of the process. The contracting for it is probably a bigger mess. So in our lab in Texas A&M, we have some early preliminary results. We have a GPU that we're running. We're calling him Hal, both as a reference to the space movie as well as to honor Hal Finney, the recipient of the first Bitcoin transaction. Hal is autonomously trying to write his own Bitcoin transaction in a taproot multisig tree. So we'll be excited once we can push this to the blockchain. So if you find these ideas compelling, I'm going to launch something called the Bitcoin Research Institute, which is really to connect these two worlds of research and development, and really bring Bitcoin together with a lot of the major advances in AI. The truth is, right now they're still separate, and I think their more collaboration can and definitely will help. I expect to have greater connection between the academy and Bitcoin development. There is an army of researchers and faculty out there. We need the best minds onto Bitcoin to make all of this future a reality. And I would like to help build out the talent pipeline so that the next generation of students are excited and interested in working on Bitcoin. The ideas that I've presented here are not my own. They are actually an example of 50 years of economics. These are a half dozen Nobel laureates who formulated many of the original ideas that led to some of my remarks here. And so I believe this is one more example of research and development coming together. And I expect and hope for this to continue in the future. So let me just close with one final remark. I think this vision that I have painted for you of Bitcoin combined with machine intelligence, I think underneath that there's a deep and somewhat poetic irony, which is that human beings will need Bitcoin in order to secure our highest economic freedom in the future, for us and for our posterity. Thank you, and please stay in touch. Principles of Bitcoin is my website. Thank you.